Hi, all. This week we're talking about women and rhetoric in ancient Greece. This is a challenging topic because there's simply not very much information about women and their specific roles and duties and responsibilities in ancient Greece because the extant texts we have from the time are written by men and are interested more so in public activities, and women were restricted from those activities. But we do know some things, so let's talk about what we do know um, through a quick overview of what we know about women, and specifically related to rhetoric and writing, speaking in ancient Greece. So first, we'll talk just really quickly about some generalities about the roles of ancient women in ancient Greece, what we composite the roles were. We'll talk about feminism and the attempts to uncover or recover the history of rhetoric in a way that doesn't focus exclusively on male voices, but tries to be more inclusive. We'll talk about some exceptional roles, some women who are present in the history of rhetoric and how they're present and what we can make of that. And then finally, some observations on women and rhetoric in ancient Greece. Okay, so first, the role of women in ancient Greece. It is important to remember that literature in any culture is going to reflect its cultural values. So one place we can look for what were the roles and the responsibilities of women in ancient Greece is to look at the literature. Homer, as we've noted, is a foundational writer, not only for um, society and religious ideas, right, retellings of these myths, um, but also in categorizing history, right, but also in kind of setting what are these cultural, societal norms and expectations. And if we look at the wives in the Odyssey, we can get a good idea of what are some of the ways in which the ancient Greeks thought about women. So we have Penelope, who is Odysseus's wife and the mother of their children. And she turns out to be a crafty hero. And she is kind of, you can think of the example of the ideal wife in Greek times. She has a suitor pursue her constantly while Odysseus is away at war, and she never succumbs. And in fact, is crafty in the way that she maintains her fidelity and her loyalty to her husband. This is in direct contrast to Clytemnestra, who is Agamemnon's wife. And while he is gone, she takes the lover Asgisthus. And when Agamemnon returns, she plots Agamemnon's murder in the hope that her new lover will become king. Um, we can see then, right, the dangers of these evil women, and we see her described in the text. She's often described in masculine terms, and so we see that for the Greeks, for a woman to be manly in any way, whether that's physically manly or particularly in her actions and her words to be manly, to be aggressive, contentious, all these things is a negative, and that is embodied in Clytemnestra's character. And then, of course, Helen, who we read in Encomium of, we read Gorgias, was Menelaus's wife, the lover of Paris, who abducts her and brings her um, back to Greece, and is ultimately blamed as the cause of the Trojan War, which results in the death of many, many, many of her people, as well as many Greeks. She is the face that launched 1,000 ships, famously, and her character is interesting because she acknowledges her her actions and how bad she was, and calls herself basically calls herself a bitch for having done having kind of seduced Paris and gone away with him, and caused this great war. And so, where does that fit in when you think about women? Well, it's about kind of the woman's natural ability to seduce men through their sexuality and the dangers of that and what it can lead to. And in this case, like the worst possible scenario, right? It's not just the murdering of one person, it's not just a breakup of a marriage. It is actually the cause of a huge war that results in destruction and death, and long-term separation for soldiers, all these things. And she takes the blame. She accepts the blame for that. So in some people argue that she in some way is a redemptive character in that way, right? She redeems herself by taking on that responsibility. Whereas some people obviously, um, as we talked about before, point out kind of what that says about how Homer and the Greeks might have viewed women during this time. Now, of course, these are literary examples. There are other literary examples. If you've read Euripides' Medea, you'll see that that's a story in which a wife, to get revenge on her husband, will kill their children. Another role of a kind of a negative, definitely a negative view. Um, and she's another woman who is oftentimes described in manly ways. She's contentious with her husband. But we do see this view that married women are potentially dangerous to their husbands. And they're dangerous because of the reason that Helen is dangerous, and that's through their sexuality. That if they take a lover, they can be easily persuaded to do things that will lead to worse outcomes. So the roles of Athenian women in the classical period of Greece. So Homer is before this, right? But classical period, we're talking about these sophists all the way through Aristotle in the 5th and 4th centuries BCE, were primarily then those of wife and mother. Now we're obviously talking about Greeks of middle class and upper class standing, um, where they didn't have to work, just like in every society, including the United States during previous times when we like to think that only men work. That was never really true. Women in lower classes and women in Greece who were slaves, for example, worked constantly, and they worked in more domestic positions, um, and so we should recognize that. But these women in Athens who were of middle and upper class would not work. And they were primarily wives and mothers, and their job was really to stay at home, to the extent that sometimes women weren't allowed to leave their homes without an escort, and were often relegated to some kind of interior chamber where they couldn't be viewed through the exterior windows. So they spent a lot of time in the homes. We can see in this image, for example, this might be an image of a middle class or upper class woman surrounded by other women who got together with a slave in the back to fan them. We see them entertaining each other with music and conversation. And it's important to note that women in Athens were generally educated, particularly in music and poetry. And poetry, as we've discussed, poetry was sung during this time, was deeply associated with music, and was separate from the kind of public speaking that we're talking about when we talk about rhetoric, right? Very separate from that. Women, in fact, were not citizens in ancient Greece, and they had no individual rights or roles in public speaking and events outside of perhaps religious rights, and we'll talk about that momentarily. So it's important that these married women in Athens had less freedom than slaves, foreigners, and women in many other city states and territories. So what we are going to see is that the women who we know of who participated in creating texts that have lasted, like Edwana. Well, Edwana was a Greek, but like Sappho, for example, or women who were written about in Athens at the time by Plato. Um, that those people were not Athenian women, and didn't have other rights that Athenian women might have, like the right to be married, but it gave them some kinds of freedom. It's also important to note that Athens, as the center of culture during this time, had more laws and was more restrictive than lots of the other city states and territories that were part of the Greek Republic and then the Greek Empire. Um, and so even earlier on in Sparta, where the men were famous for being warriors and were often out to war, because women had to run a lot of the day-to-day business of the city state, They were more typically educated and more typically expected to take on more public roles. But Sparta was not the site of this great golden age in classical Greece. And so we don't have extant texts from those people. We don't know what kind of public speaking was happening. Were there speech writers? Were there educators? We don't really know. We do know that women in Sparta were encouraged to exercise so they would have stronger babies. And that they were more educated in general in other things because they had to take on other duties like running businesses while their husbands were off to war. But married women, once again, had very little freedom and very little public access. Okay, so what are some images we have that show us some things about women in ancient Greece? Well, first, of course, on the urn we have what's a water pitcher, I guess. We have a woman seated who is likely to be the mother who is receiving her child back from a nanny who would have been a slave. In the center, we see a group of women who are getting water. So on the left-hand side, you see a woman filling her pitcher. And you see the other women are holding their empty pots or maybe full pots. We don't know. Maybe the ones standing up are full and the ones sideways are empty at the watering hole. So what are they doing while one woman is filling her water? Well, they're having a chance to talk to one another, right? So this is one of those public spaces where women were together and interacted publicly, but not necessarily giving speeches, more things, informal things like conversations. But you can see why women, when they were allowed to leave the house as married women to do chores like this, that it was an enjoyable activity. So it's hard work, right, to carry pitchers of water everywhere, but it's also a time when they could intermingle. It is worth noting, of course, that many of the people who did these, particularly for the upper class, were slaves and were not the actual women of the houses. Okay, and then finally we have a drawing of a loom, and weaving is very important. We oftentimes think about the roles of the woman as mother, as cook, as kind of caretaker of the home. And maybe we forget in our modern times that also included making clothes, and not just making clothes from scraps of fabric, right, that we could buy already prepared, but by actually weaving our own cloth. And so that's an important activity. And we see the loom and weaving as important when we talk about women in many cultures, because the metaphor of weaving or putting these different strings that are individual together is an excellent metaphor for how we might bring people together from different warring factions. And it is certainly worth noting that women were married. Um, you did not choose who you married typically. Those marriages were arranged, and they were often arranged for some kind of financial or political benefit for one's family or society. So they are kind of like the weavers of peace and of finance, as well as right actual literal weavers of cloth, right? Um, so what's the problem then is that we're left with an abundance of male written texts that are primarily focused on men and very little about women during the time. So we have to pull a lot of things from these fragments of pottery and from what men have said in their own texts about what women can and can't do, what the laws of the time said that we still have access to, and then kind of what the historical tradition has brought down to us. And what that effectively does is it silences women in this history. And so in the 1980s, there is a surge in the interest in feminism, with second wave feminism. And part of that is feminist historic research, even focused specifically on rhetoric and composition studies. And that starts off with this idea that we need to kind of identify who were these women who were writing at this time and see if we can actually find those texts, right? Which texts that are extant are not yet attributed to anyone. Are there any clues to suggest that there might be a female author? Are there texts and fragments of text that haven't been identified yet? And so that work kind of starts in earnest. And in the 1990s, we see that work evolve to include what we call feminist historiography. And historiography is basically rereading those texts that kind of define history for us, okay? And history is not just a modern concern. The ancient Greeks wrote histories of their own times, of the generations before them that led them to their current times, and we have texts and fragments of texts that are histories from the time. We can also think about the texts we've read so far, right? The speeches we read so far, and the text we will read from Plato in particular and Aristotle, where they oftentimes talk about other real people in their texts. Even though those texts aren't histories, they do communicate information about other people. So what happens when they mention women? What do they say about women? What do they say about what those women could or could not do? Do those women ever have a voice in those texts? And so we'll see how oftentimes those women don't, they might be mentioned, but they don't necessarily have a voice in the text, or if they do, they speak through a male speaker. That interest in feminism expands to include more intersectional work. So let's not just look at women, right? Because when we looked at women, maybe we only looked at upper class women, the wives of these people who we have extant texts from, and their friends and their community. But what about the lives of women who had to work, the lower class women? What about the lives of the women who were slaves? What about the lives of women who were itinerant, like our sophist teachers? They were itinerant doing other things, being courtesans, for example. Prostitution was very big in ancient Greece. They had very different ideas about sex and sexuality than we do now, and sex was a more considered a natural thing, and so it was typical that there would be brothels and bathhouses, and that there were homosexuality and heterosexuality all within the same people and the same society. It wasn't looked down upon or looked at as significantly different as it is today. Okay, and then we start to say, well, if we want to look at what these other women were doing, not just the women who are maybe mentioned in history, in histories that describe politicians, speakers, and kings, right, and their families. I might mention the women around them, all of whom would have been upper class. That we need to look for other kinds of texts, and we need to look more through different disciplines. And so that's when you see, like, how can we read these art objects or these archaeological objects to tell us something about the lives of women? And is there anything there that suggests that they did write or speak? Were there, even if that was in not public ways? Okay, so these kinds of approaches are what have led us to recover some female voices in our past. So this week you're reading in Edwana, who was a priestess. She was a high priestess in Sumeria. And so obviously not Greek. I should clarify that. I don't think the book clarifies that enough. There is no reason to believe that the ancient Greeks inherited anything in any of the extant writings of Enedwana. The Greek Republic nor the Greek Empire ever reached that far to Babylon. So they definitely didn't reach Sumer or Ur. And so we should clarify that the reason that this is included in this week's reading is to show that there were roles for women in public ceremonies as priestesses, and because there's extant work from like nearly 2,000 years before the period we're talking about in ancient Greece, that we know that this was possible and that there were cultures that allowed more roles for women, even though her role was appointed by and secondary to the role of her father as king in general. Okay, and there is a balance there in the goddess that she was said to be high priestess of. Nana, which would be Inanna, which is the goddess associated with the moon. But it's a goddess was very powerful and was interested not only in kind of things we might think of as domestic, but also in things that are violent. And so it's important to note that and to see how, well, while her particular work might not have ever made it to ancient Greece, those ideas certainly would have been interchanged around Mesopotamia and then eventually around the Mediterranean and into that classical period, the golden period in Greece. So it's just to give us an idea. And also like to recognize that when we start to think about feminist approaches to history of rhetoric, we also create the idea, oh, wait a minute, we can look for other excluded voices. And those excluded voices might be the Sumerians, right? It might be ancient Egyptians, might be Northern Africans, might be Ethiopians. It's important to note that we know historically that ancient Greece, there were black citizens, there were would now be Arabic citizens. And so there was a mixing of these different peoples from different conquered areas who made their way to Athens. They wouldn't have had the same rights as Athenians, but we know they existed. So scholars are interested in kind of recovering, well, what were their roles? What rights did they have? What things did they do? Right, in the same way we think about women. And so I just included a couple of tiny fragments from what you're reading, but I am an Edwana, high priestess of Nana, with a single heart. I am devoted to Nana, right? So some interesting things to think about are the role of religion. You said these hymns or religious songs, poems, include the first person I, and she's of course the high priestess, so she is leading. She's the leader, right, of these religious rites and ceremonies, and the I connection can be read in multiple ways. It's been read as we think historically she would have been essentially married to the church, something like what the Catholic priests do. Would have been, symbolically married to Inanna as the god that she worshipped, the goddess that she worshipped, and that way, of course, she stripped from some of her feminine, historically feminine roles because she wouldn't become then a wife of a man, right? She would be instead married to the church. So in some ways, in order to have the power that she has as a high priestess, she gives away some of her womanness in a traditional sense. So there is interesting literature or scholarship that explores this idea. There's also the notion of, well, when you use the first person, what does that symbolize about how the Sumerians thought about the gods and goddesses? Was it a personal relationship, I and my connection, instead of a we relationship as a group? So if you're interested in that, certainly, even though it doesn't fall within ancient Greece and ancient Rome, it's certainly something that's worthy of exploration, and you certainly can feel free to explore that more deeply. There's some really good recent scholarship. The other fragment, this poem, spoken for the sacred woman, is exalted. Praise the mountain destroyer. Praise her who, together with An, who is the god of the sky and is male, received the unchanging powers. Praise my lady wrapped in beauty. And I include this because it shows kind of feminine traits in that balance, once again, between Inanna and An, that most mythologies have, that there are male and female figures and they tend to balance each other out in some way, but that she has this power that not only is to be beautiful, right, or beauty, but also to be a destroyer. So it's interesting to think about that. So, but let's think about what we know about priestesses in ancient Greece. Well, here are some more, looking at some more pots and pottery. You can see on the one on the left, we see a high priestess perhaps seated, and then we have women coming to make some kind of offering at the altar where another priestess is. We see another offering being made here, a group of women with musical instruments, with a bull for sacrifice, or an ox for sacrifice, carrying food to bring to the altar, where you see kind of like bricks with a bird on top, and perhaps it's the goddess Athena, the goddess of war, because there she seems to stand with a spear and a shield. So you kind of see, but we see that these are women performing these acts, right? They're dressed in different kinds of long garbs that suggest women's clothes. They have in some cases bumps for breasts, things that symbolize that they're women. Okay, so these it was typical for women to have these positions of power in ancient Greece, as long as they were restricted to their temples where they served and worshipped. They could lead rites and ceremonies in those areas, but they would not have been traveling out in public. They are essentially dedicate their lives to that temple and would live their lives there. So they have more freedom within that space, but they're kind of confined in that space. And the last one, we see a really ornate drawing of women who are preparing bulls or oxen for sacrifice. Those towers behind each of the oxen are typical altars during this time. Okay. So next we have Sappho. Now we are in ancient Greece, but still before our golden period where we're reading these rhetoricians, right? Sappho is not a rhetorician. Sappho was a poet. And so it is important that we note that difference. But of course, there are plenty of ways to read poetry through a rhetoric lens. So there certainly is work that looks at kind of the rhetoric of Sappho and what she's saying about women and what she's saying about her role. It's also important to note that the reason we have so many fragments in one entire poem from Sappho is because Sappho was considered in her own time to be one of the greatest Greek lyricists, and she was regularly studied through Roman times. Unfortunately, like many texts, they were lost to time. They fade out of fortune, when people are no longer interested in studying them in particular. And then they get discarded or lost. But we do have quite a bit, considering how old it is, from Sappho. And there are some great excerpts in our book. But the one I want to share here is: we heard them chanting, young Adonis is dying. O Cytherea, what shall we do now? Batter your breasts with your fists, girl. Tatter your dresses. I just included a map here so you can kind of see where Lesbos was. So you can see how it's kind of close to where some of our the other people we've been talking about are coming from, right? They're coming from maybe just north of here in what's now Turkey. But this gives a modern map to show you where things are, okay? And Lesbos, yeah, is there off the coast of Turkey. Okay. So well, it won't go click to the next. There we go. So what she's talking about in this poem, though, is funerals, and funerals were really public things. And men famously would give public speeches in which they praised the fallen, but women were also part of the manifestations around funerals. So women who lost loved ones would cut their hair short and would scratch themselves and, as she says, beat their breasts. As the image in the bottom right here shows, beat their heads. Basically, they would flagellate themselves, they'd harm themselves as a way to kind of express the pain they were feeling in a physical way. So express that emotional pain in a physical way. There's some debate about what that means, because it seems to be exclusive to women. That is, why women in particular were expected to express themselves in these ways. But perhaps it's because this was their public way of mourning, as opposed to the giving of speeches through epideictic rhetoric or ceremonial rhetoric that the men might be able to do. But we see in these images people carrying a coffin or a sarcophagus, and we see women with shortened hair. And I think really notably in the little sculpture is the woman beating her head, and you see the scratches on her body. That suggests those practices. Aspasia is the other woman we're going to read about in this section of the course, but we don't have extant texts from Aspasia. We don't even know if she actually wrote any texts that would have been preserved. Um, our books, the reading we are reading suggests many possibilities for who she was, but it seems to make sense to me that she was a courtesan, which means she was a foreigner who came to Athens uh, as a prostitute and then later is said to have opened a brothel, and basically made a living off of her body and her sexuality. Um, but through that, we know that she gained a lot of social capital and became an important person during that time in ancient Greece because many different people wrote about her. But most significantly is the passage we get in Plato's Menexenus, which is about her, but does not allow her to speak for herself, and she doesn't actually appear. She is talked about instead by Socrates in Plato's dialogue, and so she got that power because she becomes the lover of Pericles, who was said to be one of the greatest orators in ancient Greece, and in the Menexenus, Plato or Socrates suggests that Aspasia uh, taught him and or taught Pericles and was an excellent speaker herself. There's some reason to believe that she was a semi-public figure because she was allowed to attend the symposia, which normally would Athenian women would not have been able to attend. But because she was an Athenian woman, she wasn't allowed to be married to Pericles, just lived with him as his concubine, and instead might have been allowed to attend those things and participate in the conversations with the men, because she would have been off limits to the other men once she was with Pericles. Um, so you can see how these kind of people who are in these liminal spaces, who are outside of mainstream society, maybe had opportunities for more rhetorical practice than the upper class women in ancient Greece. Here we see the description from the Menexenus that Socrates says, well, in my case, Menexenus, it's no great surprise if I am capable of making the speech, since my teacher was in fact a woman of some ability where rhetoric is concerned. She created many fine orators. Pericles, the son of Xanthippus, was the finest speaker in Greece. And this is right before then he's going to go on and basically quote a speech from Aspasia. Now, do we know she actually gave that speech? Do we? And there's some argument as to whether Plato and Socrates. Well, Plato is saying this because he actually using Socrates to say this because he actually believes Aspasia was a fine orator and really did teach Pericles things, or if he's poking fun. And so some of the academic articles that are included in this section kind of hash out that debate. But the fact that she's referenced and discussed in so much detail here and in other works of Plato and then later by other writers means that there was a real person named Aspasia, that she really did have enough import in society at that time for people to include in the things they were writing, even though she wasn't a Greek. She wasn't an Athenian, right? So that's significant. And as you read, right, in this example, right, where from the Menexenus, she talks, it's a funeral speech, which ties back to the last idea. Here I've included some images that historians and archaeologists believe are examples of women entertaining men at these symposia. So remember the symposia where men might get together and read poems and drink, the big drinking parties, basically. So the first one on the left shows a woman dancing to entertain a man, and on the right you see a woman playing music while they eat and discuss whatever men of the time would discuss at symposia, right? Um, so it is interesting to think that there are these women who are always present. What was their role? Did they ever actually get to be involved in these conversations? Did they ever recite the poems? Did they ever write the poems that or sing the poems that we don't have extant texts for? And to think about these things is what feminist scholars are interested in, is kind of what can we recover? What can we know about the rhetorical practices of women during every time in history, right now in classical Greece? Uh, what did these women do, think, feel, say? And why don't we have any text, or where might we find evidence to support our suppositions? Well, some evidence might be in things like the art of the time. Diatema we won't read about in this section. Diatema is less, it's less related to rhetoric and more related to philosophy. Diatema, it was described in the Symposium, which is Plato's discourse on love, as a prophetess. Here he describes, and now I shall let you alone and proceed with the discourse upon love, which I heard one day from a Mantinean woman named Diatema. In this subject she was skilled, and in many others too. For once, by bidding the Athenians offer sacrifices 10 years before the plague, she procured them so much delay in the advent of the sickness. Well, I also had my lesson from her in love matters. So now I will try to follow up on the points on which Agathon and I have just agreed by narrating to you all on my own account, as well as I'm able, the speech she delivered to me. So very much the same way as he speaks in the Menexenus on behalf of Aspasia, here he speaks on behalf of Diotima. One thing of note here is scholars disagree as to whether Diotima was a real person or just an invention for this particular work by Plato. There are some strong arguments, I think, to suggest that the other characters in Plato's dialogues tend to be based at least on real people, or are real people that we can identify. But there's not a lot of, there are not other texts of the same time period that reference her. So make of that what you will. I think it's interesting, though, just to think about, here we have Plato once again talking about a knowledgeable woman and kind of using her ideas to try to get his point across, of course, through, once again, the voice of Socrates. We should note at this point that Plato did accept some women into his school, but it was still very rare, and those women were still excluded from public speaking. So they could come in and learn the things that you might learn as a man about public speaking, about speaking to the courts, about speaking to assemblies, about being persuasive, but and about philosophy in the natural world as well, right? Because Plato didn't just talk about rhetoric. In fact, he was more interested in philosophy and despised rhetoric, as we'll see when we get to his section. But he was certainly interested in talking about how we should communicate information. So some women were accepted to study, but it's also important to realize that in his descriptions of women, even though he says at the base men and women are very similar, almost the same, women are always the weaker. And it is suggested by many scholars he doesn't just mean physically weaker, he means weaker in every way. So that women would be weaker thinkers, that women would be weaker other things, right, in other ways. Except in these particular areas where women seem to have maybe some strength, like in love or in funerary rites, where it's about suffering, right, where it's these kind of expression of emotion rather than the rational, and rather than science and philosophy. Does that make sense? I hope. But these are big ideas that we don't really know, of course, what Plato really thought. We don't know if Diotima really existed. We don't know if Aspasia was really a courtesan, or we have these kind of fragments from which we try to build a narrative about who these people were and how they related to one another. Um, but it's interesting, once again, to think about how women's voices did exist. Of course, they're just not documented in the way that the men we've been studying are, because we just don't have extant texts from them themselves in their own words. Um, so if Diotima was real and she was a prophetess, that points to an idea about the role of these temples and religion at this period in Greece, and that is that the priestesses could be prophetesses, could be oracles for the future, and if they were good at it, could gain a lot of prestige. Um, and so, like, basically predicting the future. Okay, so in the first, we see a statesman who has come for advice, and an oracle who's maybe reading some kind of uh, device through which she is divine in the future. And if she can be convincing enough, and then her prediction turns out to be accurate, then she gains even more power as a priestess, of course. But once again, that's restricted to the inside of the temple. That's where the priestesses maybe have their limited power. And in the second, we see another, in this case, it's a soldier, right, asking, well, what should we do? So in the first, you can think, well, she was famous for telling people to make sacrifices 10 years before this thing she knew was going to happen, this plague that was going to come, and it didn't come until later, right? She by doing this, she gave them more time without the devastating event, right? A warrior might come to say same in the same way to say, is it when is it advantageous for us to attack? And the oracle would use their wisdom and make a prediction. There's, of course, a lot of debate as to if any of this was actually divine, if any of this was just women who are kind of crafty, um, and were able to kind of use that craftiness to get ahead. Or if this is a case where we have some really intelligent women who otherwise would have been excluded from these conversations, and actually by becoming part of these conversations help to make better decisions. So I think it's interesting to think about the different interpretations of, once again, these fragments of knowledge we have about ancient times and relationships to women. Um, I'll just point to one more person here, and this is Arete of Cyrene. And she was a famous teacher in the Socratic family tree. Socrates is credited as the father of many different approaches to philosophy, but it's said that Arete actually published over 40 books, none of which exist today. But we do know that that school of philosophy was interested in the balance between pleasure and pain, and the idea that people are driven towards pleasure and away from pain, but that we need to experience some pain to understand pleasure. And so, very much a two-sided idea, of kind of like the things that balance each other out, like we talked about with some of the sophists. Um, so we actually know a little bit of genealogy about the people who are part of this school, which is why we know she actually was a teacher. She actually continued her school. It was her father's school, Aristippus of Cyrene, and then she passed it on to her son, who was actually nicknamed Mother Taught. Um, so we can see that maybe that certainly it was unusual to be Mother Taught, and that's why it becomes his nickname. But also might point to the fact, well, she was a great teacher because the school continued through her. Um, but once again, the challenge here is we have some fragments of other writers in this tradition, but we don't have anything that shows us what she actually did. And thought there are a bunch of fragments later that reference her as they talk about Aristippus in particular, and Aristippus, sorry, and how that tradition carried on, um, and became ultimately hedonic in its approach. Um, so, in this quote, that does that is from Strabo, and Strabo is writing almost in the first century BCE. So he was born in 63 BCE. So right before the flip of time, right? So we're talking about hundreds of years later. People were still discussing this branch of philosophy and referencing her name in discussions of it. So she wasn't erased from discourse in the way that maybe Diotima was. Um, because her school of philosophy continued, her name continued in that way, but we just don't have any text to say what she actually did and what she actually said. So remarkable persons of Cyrene were Aristippus, the Socratic philosopher, who established the Cyrenaic philosophy, and his daughter named Arete, who succeeded to his school. She again was succeeded by her son Aristippus, named after her father, right, who was called Metrodidactos, or mother taught, and Anaxagoras, who is supposed to have reformed the Cyrenaic sect and to have introduced in its stead the Anaxagoras sect. So that's one of those histories, right? It's called a geography. In this case, it's a geography that is historical. It tells us about different people in different places in ancient times. Okay, so here are some observations. Like, what do we make of all this, right? Like, we're reading these descriptions of women, right? People talking about women or quoting women, but without the women actually there. We're looking at other kind of sources like art from pottery, like we have on the right hand side here. We're looking at histories written later around the same time and then later in ancient Greece and ancient Rome to kind of find descriptions of these thinkers and trying to uncover the roles of women in ancient Greece, particularly in relation to rhetoric. So we should be aware of the barriers, right? So women were educated, but they weren't educated typically in the same way as men, particularly in Athens. So there were some areas of education that were encouraged, particularly music and poetry. Poetry, of course, once again, was sung. One of the challenges to dealing with Sappho is you can't reproduce that singing because we don't know what the singing really sounded like. And the meter in the ancient Greek is very different from any kind of contemporary language meter. And so we're really losing a lot of the form. We might get the substance, we're not getting the form of that poetry. But poetry was encouraged because it taught things, as we talked about with Homer, right? It taught things about virtue and what it meant to be a good Greek. So that limited education also comes from a patriarchal society, and that patriarchal society has very strict rules for its women who are property of its men. So while men are citizens and men can speak publicly, men can be educated, men can go off to war, all these things are limited to men, which leaves women behind. And those women, once they're with their children and then once they're married, are property of the men in their lives. If they're slaves, clearly they're property of the men who own them. It won't be until Roman times until women can actually own property. Late Roman times when women can actually own property, and even then they're still not citizens. They still can't vote. They still can't participate in public deliberative rhetoric. They still don't appear in courts. They have to be represented by a man. So those social constraints are significant for women during this time, during the entire classical period. Some of the other social constraints, though, have to do with, well, what are those kind of, what's a good woman and a bad woman? Well, a good woman in ancient Greek times is a faithful wife. While it was expected for men, even the men who were married, to have lovers and to visit prostitutes, that was not true for women. Once women were married, they were dedicated to being the wife of that man. Some of the critiques of Sappho talk about homoeroticism in her work, and there certainly are poems that point to sexual relationships between women. There's certainly also poems that talk about sexual relationships with men, and love between women and love between men. But what we know about ancient Greek society is that it was common for men to experience homosexuality, oftentimes when they were being educated with older men. And then there were bathhouses where men engaged in sexual acts with one another. There were plenty of brothels where men went to see prostitutes. And that maybe was true in some respects for women as well, at least in Lesbos, where it seems that women before they were married may have been prepared to be married by kind of teaching them about sex and sexuality, so that once they were married, they could be the wife that their husband needed. But certainly once they were married, they were very much more restricted. Um, Other social constraints, of course, differ by your role in society. So the upper class and maybe wealthy or middle class people, the women didn't necessarily or had slaves to help them manage the domestic duties, um, but they were still responsible for their homes. Um, so we know that they spoke right to people. They were in charge of certain aspects of their lives, and so that it points like just to holes in our knowledge. Okay, but then also there's the issue of the lack of recognition. So if we had a significant woman orator, do we know that that person would have been looked upon kindly by the majority of uh, Greek writers? And maybe that's why some of these voices have been lost, have been silenced. In the case of Aspasia, certainly silenced in the fact that that Plato has Socrates speak for her rather than allowing her to speak for herself, right? And that happens with Diotima as well. Um, so it has to do, right, with these barriers that exist during the time in which this is all happening. But of course, there's barriers of time for us as well. Only 3 to 5%, it's estimated only 3 to 5% of texts from ancient Greece are extant. And many of the texts that are extant are fragments. So we're trying to, in some cases, maybe you're just missing a word or two and you can kind of guesstimate what it should have been. But and sometimes you'll see when we're reading it says missing 20 lines. Well, that's significant. There's no way to bridge that gap, right? Um, a lot of the texts we have are not original to these times, right? So if you have a carving or an engraving, well, maybe that's from that time. You have a piece of pottery that has some writing on it, maybe that's from that time. But most of the things we have are because they've been copied and copied by teachers to be, or by historians to be remembered or to be reused as lessons. That's how we get Homer as complete as we do, is because these are texts that the Iliad and the Odyssey are texts that were used repeatedly over long periods of time for teaching both in ancient Greece and ancient Rome. And even today, when I was in 7th or 8th grade, I had to read the Iliad, for example. Um, of course, other barriers that we should be aware of are shifting politics, wars, languages, and religions. A reason a lot of these texts don't exist is because they were destroyed during wars. But with those wars come changes in politics, and those politics can be more and less patriarchal. And they might have intentionally destroyed texts by certain people. So if they're more democratic, they might destroy things written by the or written in support of or by the previous ruler who was autocratic, right? And if democracy fails, then the people who are anti-democracy might want to destroy those texts. Languages. So the Sappho did not write in a Greek that was well known on the in the mainland in Athens. And so as people had less reason to know these other languages, unless things were translated continuously into your current version of your language, for example, in that shift from ancient Greek to Latin, for example, a number of things were left behind. And so if they're not copied, then eventually if those texts are lost, they're gone forever. And then notably religions. In early Christianity, there was a big push to destroy pagan documents, specifically anything that referenced pagan religions and religious practices. And so a lot of the texts we lost that potentially were from women, because those women were priests and poets writing about the gods and the myths and right, kind of like Edwana does, right, kind of praising this pagan god. Those texts were particularly um, laid out for destruction, or chosen for destruction. But we should still recognize that women played significant roles in ancient times, right? Even if we don't have a lot of evidence of this, we know there were women. We know they did something, and so part of that has to be rhetorical practice, right? Even if that's in other forms that weren't necessarily always public forms. Um, there were women who knew how to write, for example, right? And so those women would have written or could have written something. We don't have those texts right now, right? There is work to recover more of these texts. We find things, they're finding things constantly around the Mediterranean and even in Mesopotamia, right? They're even older, that are giving us more hints, but also kind of rereading these other kinds of texts. So looking at images from the time and saying, well, what does this show us about women and how women interacted with one another, how women interacted with men? Um, so this is a great week to think about your own perspectives and methodologies. What do you want to gain through your study of ancient rhetoric, and how will you pursue that study? Um, I think an area like this of research shows how much there still is to argue about and to understand when it comes to these texts and to these people, and what we make of these kind of fragments of knowledge that we do have, and how we can kind of weave them together into our own argument, our own stories about um, that present our own perspective on things. And that's really the work of a scholar. But also, how will you pursue that study? So I've included um, a text that traces some of this work into the history of rhetoric from a feminist perspective in our optional readings for this week. Enjoy. If you want to discuss anything or have any questions, use the discussion board or shoot me an email. Thanks.